Good evening. I'm Sundiata Cha-Jua, and this is Real Talk. Tonight, this is the launch of the Real Talk program, which is part of Black Power Media, a constellation of radical scholar activists. And tonight is the 90th anniversary of Ida B. Wells' death. And I want to begin with a tribute to Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells Barnett died 90 years ago on March 25th, 1931. She is perhaps the most significant woman in the African American past, and certainly one of the most important people, male or female, during the Second Nadir, 1877 to the 1920s. Today, Wells Barnett is a revered historical figure. In 2020, she received a posthumous Special Citation Pulitzer Prize. However, from her death until the 1970s, her story was shrouded in the shadows reserved for militant and radical Black activists. The FBI recommended that she be denied a passport to attend the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, declaring Wells Barnett, then in her mid-50s, one of the most dangerous Negro agitators. Like Malcolm X, she is largely responsible for her own resurrection. In 1870, her 1970 autobiography rescued her from obscurity. Yet, even given her popularity, I doubt if Wells Barnett's contributions are fully understood or appreciated. Wells Barnett was the shining star who lit our path out of the gloomy past and largely out of the gloomy past and through the blood of the slaughtered, as the Negro National Anthem says. It was she, and largely she alone, who exposed the hidden truths behind lynching. After the lynching of her friend Tommy Moss and two other owners of the People's Grocery Cooperative, Wells Barnett began to investigate mob murders. She discovered that many Black lynching victims, like the owners of the People's Grocery, were prosperous competitors of white men. In a fiery editorial, she observed, "Neither character or standing avails the Negro if he dares to protect himself against the white man or becomes a rival." The Memphis authorities disarmed and disbanded the Tennessee Rifles, the African American militia. They also prohibited the selling of guns and ammunition to African Americans. Deprived of self-defense, Wells Barnett searched for a strategy to fight back. She found one in Moss's dying words. In his last utterance, Moss urged Black people to go west. Wells Barnett posited, "There is therefore only one thing left that we can do: save our money and leave a town which will neither protect our lives and property nor give us a fair trial in the courts." She thereby launched a boycott and an exodus movement. Within 6 weeks, the city's railway company was going broke. Soon, 6,000 Black people left Memphis for the Oklahoma Territory. Her research also revealed that Black men who refused to indulge in rituals of deference were lynched. And conversely, Wells Barnett uncovered that the leading citizens, the white capitalist class, played the dominant role in lynching. However, Wells Barnett's most explosive revelation struck at the heart of the South's justification for lynching. She uncovered the existence of numerous consensual relationships between Black male lynch victims and their white female accusers. It was this disclosure that led a mob in Memphis to destroy the Free Speech and Headlights building and equipment. Wells Barnett's analysis of lynching statistics cut even deeper into that threadbare lie that white men lynch Black men to protect white women. In her 1892 pamphlet, Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws in All Its Phases, revealed that only a third of lynching victims were even accused of sexual assault. That figure drops to 23% if the data set is extended to 1950. The largest amount of Black lynch victims were accused of murder, 41%. They were accused of murdering usually their boss, the land and labor barons. In addition to uncovering the class basis of lynching, Wells Barnett also expanded her repertoire of resistance. Transcending boycotts and exoduses, she transformed Booker T. Washington's accommodationist phase, self-help, into a militant anthem, armed self-help. Wells Barnett argued the lesson every Afro-American should ponder is that a Winchester rifle should have an honored place above the mantle in every Black home. Wells Barnett's struggle against racial violence has in many ways obscured her other contributions. Her contributions to women's suffrage and the formation of Black women's clubs are well known. Wells Barnett also stood at the forefront of African American education. In 1897, along with Black socialist minister, the Reverend Reverdy C. Ransom, she created one of the first kindergartens for Black children at Chicago's Bethel AME Church. Because Black men were not welcome at the Chicago YMCA, Wells Barnett launched the Negro Fellowship League in 1910. It was a rooming house, a reading room, a job center, and a working class Black male political organization. In 1913, Wells Barnett founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, the first African American women's suffrage organization. She created the club for two reasons: to build support for the passage of the Illinois Suffrage Act, which would grant women the right to vote, and secondly, to build to block race-based exclusions proposed by the white woman-led Illinois Suffrage Association. The Alpha Suffrage Club inaugurated door-to-door canvassing and block by block organizing and sponsored weekly political education classes. The Suffrage Association pursued the registration of female prisoners. Ultimately, they elected Oscar D. Priest as the first African-American Chicago alderman, as well as the first African-American elected to Congress in the 20th century. Wells Barnett was an exemplary Black radical scholar activist. She led the struggles against anti-Black racial oppression and repression and built alternative institutions. Like W.E.B. Du Bois, she is a precursor of Black studies. Wells Barnett used narrative, statistical analysis, ethnography, journalism, and historical interpretation to expose the class, gender, and racial basis of lynching. In her final contribution, her autobiography, she charts a strategy of struggle, investigation, exposure, mass organizing, armed self-defense, and the construction of counter Black-controlled institutions. Let's see if we have any questions. And if not, we will bring in Monca White.
No, that's pretty much.
Well, she's not there. Okay. Greetings. How are you today?
I'm great, thanks. How are you? I'm so sorry.
Hey. This is the launch, so it's going to be some difficulties, but we'll get it together.
Some hydration. I realized that I was waiting for 7:15. My bad.
Hey, no problem, no problem. Look,
Yeah.
I haven't seen you since July last summer?
Not even last summer. Oh, yeah, it
Yeah.
was last summer. That's right. You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right. So, Monca White, you are the author of Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance. Give
In
me
the Black Freedom Movement.
in the Black Freedom Movement. But you expand far beyond, you go back into the 19th century. And so I guess my question for you, first I want to get a sense of, for the audience to get a sense of, who are you, Mo?
Mm-hmm.
What's your story?
What's your story?
And how did Monca White, the person and the scholar activist, right? How did you become that person? And what made you the person who would write a book on Black farmers?
Yes. So first, I want to thank you, Sundi, because it was when our offices were kitty corner. You were the first person in my academic career to tell me that I had something important to say. So I'm eternally grateful to you for believing in me and for encouraging me to find my voice. You, Helen, Lou, everybody there, the Afro Am family, you all just really believed in me and supported me. And I know I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. I wouldn't have the title had it not been for you. I wouldn't have a nickname if it wasn't for you. And you all are part of my family. I truly love you. So thank you for what the trajectory that changed my postdoc, changed the trajectory of my career, and just led to Freedom Farmers. So I appreciate you. Thank you. So yeah, and raised in Detroit, we were that generation where we traveled every summer back and forth to the South. Okay. And so my mother's from Mobile.
Where in the South, Mo, yep. Are the people from?
Yep, my mom's from Mobile, Alabama. My dad's from Mobile, Alabama. My mother's from Eden, North Carolina, and my grandparents were farmers. And on my mom's side, we still have the land in our family. So every summer we go down there, and every time there was somebody starting up a pickup truck, here I was. I wanted to go. I don't know why I had this fascination with pickup trucks, but I did. And of course, my favorite Uncle Bob. You know, we had a favorite uncles. Like we didn't tell everybody was our favorite, but we all knew Uncle Bob was the favorite, and he was a farmer. So in my early years, I can really point to all the people who were farmers as really significant. And this combination of the Detroit Blackness from Detroit. And so this Detroit Blackness combined with this rural Southernness was ingrained in me in a way I never would have imagined. And it came forward in a conversation that, in terms of my research, and helped me find that. So, just thinking about all of the ways that folks were growing food, and even my family grew food in Detroit. So my dad grew food in the backyard. We had a cottage where he grew food. My sister grew food on the east side of Detroit. My grandmother was in a wheelchair. She had a container garden. And so food production was always Black to me, and which is strange when you look at the scholarship in the early 2008, you really didn't see Black folks elevated in this urban ag movement and food justice conversations. You didn't see or hear Black folks. So one of the messages that I got from my dissertation share was ask, what do you hear, but also what don't you hear? And so in these narratives of Black folks, in these narratives of who was doing what to save Detroit, I didn't see myself. I didn't see Black folks growing food. Did I get off?
Let me slow you down and dig a little bit. Yeah. So what time period are we talking about? I know that the first generation of Black folk born in the second generation, those people who were born as part of the Second Great Migration, that the first, the baby boomers, their parents brought the Southern tradition, Southern Black culture up to northern cities. I mean, there's a region we call Cleveland, Alabama North, and Chicago, Mississippi. My point is that you're a little bit younger. Yeah. So you said in Detroit, they continued to do the farming and that kind of self-sufficiency.
That's right. Okay. That's right. And so, my dad always grew food wherever we were, right? And so this food production, just the fact that it's always been Black, but yet we didn't hear those voices, that stood out to me. And then I think, in grad school, I was always drawn to social movements. You got a question?
No.
Oh, okay. So I was drawn to social movements, right? So I wanted to understand How do you explain social movements, especially those that get us to leave our families, like the Panthers? You know, you left your family, you have this cause, you're young, you putting your life on the line. I was fascinated by that, so I wanted to understand. So how do we understand how and when people join social movements? What happens when people demonstrate their agency and resist? And then, as I was trying to, my dissertation share was paying attention to the voices, but also the stories that we don't hear. And so I just felt like, as I moved to Detroit to take care of my parents, I was returning to Detroit, I knew that the movement was more than what we were hearing. I knew that the voices of folks like my family, that voice was missing. And so our voices were literally erased. And I just thought it was important for me to unearth the relationship, Black people's relationship to agriculture, historically and otherwise. I knew that we didn't leave the South because of the work. It was, we were doing all this work and we were not paid for the work. So, and then when we came up north, we were still growing food. So this whole conversation was way too facile. And I thought that it was really sort of the danger of a single story in terms of how we understand Black folks. And so, for me, just understanding and looking at the erasure of Black voices in urban ag, I'm like, okay, we can't have this. This is not the way. This is not real. This isn't reality. And in organizing the Detroit Rebellion Conference, I met Baba Malik Yakini, who was one of the co-founders of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network.
Mo, can you slow down on the, some of the Black Rebellion Conference that's commemorating 1967 rebellion?
That's right.
Can you elaborate for us and then move on with your story?
Yeah, so we were part of the organizing committee for the 2007 organizing conference. And in doing so, we met and, I was interested in understanding the kind of farming that my family was doing in the backyard. Baba Malik Yakini was organizing the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and wanted to make sure that Black folks were involved in the narratives of, just that Black folks were growing our own food and involved in food justice and food sovereignty. And so 40 some odd folks came together in the Black Star bookstore, which is Baba Malik Yakini's, it was his bookstore, and really wanted to talk about how to make sure that Black folks were cared for, had access to food, but also were involved in the conversation around what kinds of access to food, how do we make sure that food people are taken care of in human and natural disasters. So this conversation was really appealing and attractive. And so this was a story that was important. I got caught by it, bit by the bug, went to my first meeting, and that was where magic happened.
You said something that the Black Star bookstore, is that the bookstore that was started by the League of Black Revolutionary Workers?
Baba Malik, I don't know the history of that specific bookstore. I do know that Baba Malik was conscious of the League and involved in the League in some kinds of ways. I don't know exactly what the trajectory was. I don't know if it was the same store or if it was a different. I don't know. I don't know that.
Now I
don't think so. It doesn't make sense that it would, because he was too young at that point. It was, so I think that when the League came up with the store, he would have been a teenager, early 20s.
And in their teens and early 20s were involved.
That's true. Yeah. That's true. Okay. That's true. I was just thinking whether, I don't know if that was a continuation or not.
Okay.
I'd have to ask him.
So you had this based on personal experience, and that experience was very similar to first and second generation Black folks who have moved up to the South in terms of your connection to the land, going back and forth in the summers. But your book isn't just about the growing of food. You're making an argument about what you call collective agency and community resilience. And you're trying to argue that this is a form of resistance. Right. So can you elaborate for us how you see Black agricultural workers, sharecroppers, farmers, farm workers, and independent landowners as part of a resistance movement? And what are they resisting and what are they building?
So I think the collective agency and community resilience doesn't necessarily argue that farm workers, tenant farmers, and sharecroppers were demonstrating agency in agriculture. The organizations that they created So for those who joined the cooperatives, if they were able to, that's a different kind of movement. So what I'm arguing is that usually when we think about social movement strategies, we think about marches, protests, and boycotts.
Yeah.
And so when I was working with the folks in Detroit, and if we think about marches, protests, and boycotts, those actions are against the entity that we identify as a source of our oppression and exploitation. When I was sitting and talking to the folks who were, doing this food production in Detroit, what I learned was that they saw their food production as a strategy of resistance. And so they were resisting what they thought of decolonizing the palate. I mean, they had a very thoughtful theoretical analysis on what it means to resist and why they're resisting and who they were resisting. And so for me, listening to those conversations meant that they saw agriculture and food production as a strategy of resistance and resilience. And I wanted to understand what they meant by it, but also were there other historical moments when Black people have turned to agriculture to do, as a strategy of community health and wellness. And so what I found was every historical moment every economic downturn, Black folks turn to food production, thinking about food in important critical ways. And so collective agency is when we talk about agency, we often think about agency as independent, psychological, right? The decision to change. But what happens when a whole community comes together and builds a space? And so I didn't feel like that concept agency really captured what we see happening when Black folks come together and create these community spaces. Then resilience, I feel like is problematized as it should be, but it really focuses on what happens after a catastrophic event and how people rise up, come together, look out for each other. But I don't think it thoughtfully interrogates and pushes against the systems that make certain communities more vulnerable. So I think without problematizing resilience, I think that it's an incomplete analysis. So collective agency and community resilience talks about the agency and the resilience, but also problematizes the structures that have created conditions that are unlivable for Black people. A part of collective agency and community resilience were 3 strategies. One is commons as praxis. And so that one sort of says, if we all use the air, how do we make collective decisions about how the air should be used, right? So one person shouldn't be able to contaminate it for business purposes when all of us have to inhale. Water, for example, seeds, land, all these things are often in a capitalist system commodified, right? And yet we see organizations that say commons as practice because we should all have a decision and a voice in how these resources should be used. Prefigurative politics. Many of the folks in the Southern cooperative movement were, denied the right to participate in the political process. And so in their organizations, they had one person, one vote, political education. And so all of these organizations really sort of emphasize making sure that we have shared information, a study to identify what's wrong with this system, what other systems exist, and how we maximize those for our collective use and benefit. And the last concept is economic autonomy. And so when we think and talk about the ways that many of these organizations functioned, they would do some work. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to take the monetary value out of it in terms of $1 for $1. And what they wanted to do was to say, okay, so if you work at D-Town for so many hours, you get D-Town dollars. So it was a change of currency. And looking and thinking about ways to be economically autonomous and thinking, how do we come up with a creative a compensation, or just thinking about labor for labor. But really, ultimately, economic autonomy is really sort of thinking about Black communities as regenerative, making sure that money comes into the community, goes throughout the community, and isn't an extractive model, which we often see in terms of grocery stores and what have you in our communities.
Now, Mo, those 3 concepts just laid out in terms of commons as practice, prefigurative politics, and economic autonomy. People will say that they see that in the contemporary Black food security movement. Can you walk us from emancipation forward in terms of how those concepts manifested themselves in those earlier? Yeah. And I want you to especially talk about, you talked about cooperatives.
Cooperatives and collectives. So I leave space for the fact that everybody didn't follow the Rockdale Principles. And the Rockdale Principles started in the 1860s, a set of policies as an economic strategy to make sure that people have access to resources, and using cooperatives as a strategy to provide for those that are not involved in the decision making. So I think, okay, so what I did in terms of the analysis for the Scholarship for Freedom Farmers. I remember very vividly that conversation you and I had when first of all, I owe you thanks for the title Freedom Farmers, but also you and I were talking, and I think I sent you the abstract, no, my proposal before. You read it and you called me, you're like, Mo! At first it was 1886 to present. And you were like, Mo, you can't cover all them years of Black farming history in one book and in time for tenure. So you helped me sort of narrow down my concentration and attention to the Southern cooperative movement of the late 1960s. And so I picked out 3 different organizations to scale to identify various conversations of Black farmers who had established cooperatives in some way in the South to respond to and to provide resources for the community, but also to make sure they have access to land and to build. So originally what I was doing, I kept tabs, I kept documents, I kept record of all the activities that collectives and cooperatives did. And when I would find an organization, I documented it in an Excel program. I talked about what did they do. And when I did that, the analysis also then led me to these categories. One is economic, one is political, and the other one is collaborative in terms of collaborative shared decision making. And so it wasn't just these organizations that I studied in the late 60s, but in the organizations like the Colored Farmers Alliance that you pointed me to, they had shared decision making. And even though Black folks didn't have access, like the voice and the importance of participation in these, like this political education, that was an essential part of it. And so I just kind of tracked that trajectory historically throughout these various organizations, and then really sort of concentrated on the 1960s. And that's how these categories that's how the data, surfaced. That's how the analysis showed economic, political, and shared decision making. And we see that historically, and we also see, after having written the book and doing quite a bit of touring and sharing the ideas with Black farming organizations, Black ag organizations, and food justice organizations, folks are literally sort of looking at how they're responding to the to the political, the economic, and the collaborative decision making. And so it was collecting the data, categorizing, identifying the ways that they were working together, and that's how we came up with the strategies of collective agency and community resilience.
Now, one of the things that I really find amazing, and I say this in that a figure that I don't think often gets enough approbation, and that would be Booker Taliaferro of Washington. But you were able to uncover some information that showed a more progressive and perhaps nationalist side to Booker T.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love you. Booker T was one of those people. There are some people that you write about, like Mrs. Hamer. Like every time I wrote something about her, I felt closer to her. I started her chapter at her final resting place. I asked her permission to tell her story. When I first started the book, I couldn't tell you how many people were like, I'm writing about Mrs. Hamer. And they were like, Mrs. Hamer? I haven't. I was like, wait. You haven't heard about Mrs. Hamer. So thank goodness the day has come where now we're, her work and her words and her legacy have resurfaced. So I got off on a tangent. Take me back. What was your question again? Talking about Mrs. Hamer.
My question was that you kind of rehabilitated.
Oh, right. Booker T. Right. Okay.
You can't really rehabilitate Booker T. Some things that were more positive.
Well,
I think your line of argument was that when you were writing about Fannie Lou Hamer, that there was you felt good about that.
That's right. And with Booker T, it wasn't easy, and we fought. I mean, there were some days where it was like, woo, I can't believe you just said that. Woo, no, he didn't. I was just really just sort of, there were some things that he said that really like hurt my feelings, right? I mean, for lack of another.
No, don't keep the audience in.
Okay, I'm about to come. I'm coming.
Sure.
So what bothered me the most about Booker T. Washington was that he talked about Black farmers, especially in the Black Belt, in a way that criticized them for the conditions that a structure that plantation slavery created. In other words, he would say things like they weren't very smart, they weren't very clean, without interrogating the very structure that created those realities. And I think he also said some things that, it may have been a lazy reference or something to that effect. And of course, being an activist in the 90s and taking over, the president's office and, on campus, we really did not find an affinity for Booker T. And so what I wanted to do was and I had to erase what I thought I knew about his work and his words. And I literally went in to say, okay, I know what I think I know about Booker T. Washington. I know what I've heard. I know what I've read. But I want to open my eyes to say, what contributions has he been able to make to Black farmers then? And Tuskegee's still here. He's still making his legacy is still making a contribution in terms of Black agriculture. And there are all kinds of really super important contributions historically. For example, the students who went to, one, he did field research before he even started Tuskegee. He wanted to find out what were the conditions that people were living in, and he wanted to make sure that the students who came will also return and offer something of benefit to their families. And what we know is that the Tuskegee alum returned to their home counties, and in those counties where they were Tuskegee alum, they had the largest land ownership in those communities because that was a part of his legacy. There are other things, the farmers conferences, the Professional Ag Workers Conference, the first Ag Extension, Thomas Campbell was there. And so there's so many things. Of course, we can't ignore his hiring George Washington Carver, right? And I think Tuskegee has this battle between the two, right? In some ways, you go to Tuskegee and it's like Booker T, everything. And it's like, oh yeah. And then, I understand why it's important to them to uplift the legacy of Booker T, but I also think it's important to really sort of think differently about George Washington Carver. I think we lose a lot when we reduce him to soybeans and peanut butter, right? So if we think about him as the father.
Tell us
I'm coming.
No, do your thing, Mom.
Here it is. Here you go. So when we think about, they talk about Rodale as the founder of sustainable agriculture, but he comes out, I think he was born in like the 50s. George Washington Carver was saying, when other people were saying, don't worry about the land, don't worry about the soil, there's more where that came from, right? So you can use toxins, you can use herbicides, you can use these kinds of chemical contaminants for fertilization and, pesticides, and don't worry about it. He was like, I don't think so, right? I don't know how much we have, but I don't think we should be saying that there's more where that came from. So he really taught people how, especially small farmers, how to maximize their land, how to maximize what they were growing. He talked a lot, about compost, which is an important critical aspect and component of sustainable agriculture. He talked about crop rotation, which came from George Washington Carver. And he also wrote nice pamphlets where he had recipes, and he believed in food sovereignty, food security. He believed that the farmers were growing the food should also be food secure off season and on season. So he talked to them about how to go out into the forest to get nutrients for your growing. He talked about how to, grow peas, and peas were good for your cattle and for the family. And he also talked a lot about the recipes. And, he said, there was a quote, he said, I truly believe that there's no subject more important than food. And so we overlook him by only concentrating by the product and not by what he did, which I think challenged. He wasn't one of those professors who was like, yeah, I'll see you in class. He was responsible for the movable school. He wanted to break down those boundaries between community and university. He made sure that his scholarship was accessible and usable to the folks that he was committed to teaching. So George Washington Carver's legacy, I think, has been muted. And I think we need to think differently about his contributions.
George Washington Carver corresponded with Lenin. And I always found that interesting. Yeah. And of course, they were talking about agriculture and agricultural production, but I always found that quite interesting. Now, so you're looking at the development of Black cooperatives. So tell us something about the African-American cooperative farming movement and again, move us from the 19th century to the present to, say, Freedom Farms
Sure.
or the Southern Cooperatives, and their significance.
So what I did in the beginning, in the introduction, was I really sort of tried to map the trajectory from carrying seeds in our hair through the Middle Passage to demanding provision grounds during, plantation slavery, to Congo Square, where, that was our day off and we celebrated African traditional religions, but also sold, whatever we would barter, we would exchange. And I talk about the work of the Colored Farmers Alliance, where there was 1.2 million farmers that were organizing throughout the South and really were able to pull their resources together. They bought land together. They had trading posts where, folks could come and be treated with respect. And then I think it's also important to sort of recognize just the language and the ways that food has been used, food production as a conversation. So in addition to agriculture writ large, I'm also specifically looking at the ways that Black folks have fought for the right to feed ourselves and to build our communities, to feed our communities in ways that are healthy and also benefit from the resources of our agriculture. And so moving from the Colored Farmers Alliance, and then you've got other examples that I'm blanking on right now because you're a historian and you made me nervous, but just really sort of thinking about, let me get to the Southern Cooperative Movement, which is where I think where Mrs. Hamer really comes clear, is because I feel like what happened was all of her work to fight for the right to vote meant that she still returned to Ruleville, and still there were communities that were not able to eat. And so she started Freedom Farm. And that was really something.
When did she start Freedom Farms?
69.
Okay.
1969. And so there was a Black family who had run into some tax problems, and they felt good knowing that they were selling the land to her because they wanted to make sure that it was going to be useful. She ended up getting 600, that was 40 acres in that sale, but she ended up having 680 acres, and all the things we think are new, right? Think folks are like, oh yeah, community gardens, that's new. No, it ain't. They had community gardens, they had commercial kitchens, they had food processing, all those parts of the food justice movement that are food preservation, all of these. And so Mrs. Hamer's slogan was, as long as I have a pig in a garden, nobody can tell me what to do. And so that then tells, in addition to conversations like the Paris's, Reverend Wendell Paris says you can free yourself when you can feed yourself. So then this agriculture becomes articulated as a strategy that they are using. They've identified this as a strategy to move and work toward their freedom. So this work of the Southern Cooperative Movement, there were several throughout the South of organizations and communities that were establishing co-ops. You had folks doing agricultural co-ops, you had handicrafts co-ops, you had utilities co-ops where folks were, making sure that we have electricity or water. And so all these conversations become really important right now when you see what's going on in Texas, right? When you see climate change and these disasters, we have examples that we can go to where Black folks saw those vulnerabilities in Southern communities, and even like water systems and all those kinds of things. People then began to think about what would it look like if we established a co-op to make sure that our communities are cared for in a way that's respectful and honorable, and also returns to us those benefits. And so in the late 60s, there were so many Southern Cooperative Movement organizations that established these co-ops. I'm limited in terms of the data. Now, as a historian, you know how hard it is. Some of these questions that we have, I have so many organizations for which I cannot find. I can find the name, I can find the location, but I can't find any records. So one of the things I'm encouraging all of us to do in those organizations that we're active in, make sure you assign a keeper of the records. There will be someone in the future who, and so I'm, just how do we make sure this information is passed on? My research would have been a lot richer had I had access to the kinds of records of several of the organizations, but they didn't exist. And so in looking at the ones that I was able to concentrate on, these are the stories and the examples that I think offer us an alternative to feeling vulnerable in this current political moment.
Well, I want to kind of switch to some contemporary issues. I heard on the news today that during Trump's time, that the settlement that Black farmers received only 1%
No, 0.1% of the
Zero point.
zero. It's in the Washington Post. 0.1% of the COVID provisions given to farmers went to Black farmers.
Can you speak to that as a well? It may or may not be a more extreme example, but it certainly is a legacy.
It's a very yes. So
It's a relationship between Black farmers and the federal government.
Yeah. So it's sticky, for lack of right. And listening to some of the testimony today, Mrs. Shirley Sherrod, whose story is powerful. She has lived her life fighting for Black farmers. Mentioned she was the only person fired from the USDA for discrimination. I mean that idea just anyway. So you want to know? Let me tell you about
the Shirley Sherrod story is probably a decade old now.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking that people who may watch this
right. Yep.
won't know.
Yep. I'm happy to share. Yep. So when Obama gets elected, he hires Vilsack as the Secretary of Agriculture. Vilsack went to somebody he knew had been working for Black farmers forever, and that was Mrs. Shirley Sherrod. She was active in the Southern Rural Women's Movement. She started an organization called New Communities that had 6,000 acres that was purchased in the late 60s and up until 85. It was a cooperative, and they had all kinds of activities that were going on. Mrs. Sherrod's father was murdered by a farmer over a dispute, and the murder of her dad was never found. She meets and falls in love.
White farmer?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
She meets and falls in love with Reverend Sherrod, who is a field organizer for SNCC. When her father was murdered, before he was murdered, she said she was leaving the South as soon as she could. When her father was murdered, she decided she would never leave. She meets Charles Sherrod. They then become involved in SNCC, and their work then leads them to start New Communities, which is one of the first African-American land trust and the largest. And so,
what's the land trust?
Sure, it is a collective. Right, I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. I'm okay. I'm excited, and yes, thank you for helping me, Phil. So a land trust means that it isn't an individual who owns it, but it's an entity that is shared by a board, a group of people, to make sure that they make decisions about it. And so, my friend Dara Cooper says, individually, land ownership makes us vulnerable, but collectively, we have power. And so it means that the land can be decided, and shared in terms of how we make decisions about it. So they started New Communities. And amongst all of these SNCC organizing they were doing, they go to New Communities and started as a strategy to fix what's broken in Georgia and to make sure that folks are cared for. The federal government had given them some money. The Office of Economic Opportunity had given them some money, but the local and regional racists refused to release that money. They held on to the funds, refused them to allow access to the funds. The land goes into foreclosure. And these racists were so awful that they dug holes and imploded all the buildings in front of the folks who had been. So, after that happened, Mrs. Sherrod was contacted by the Obama administration and the Vilsack leadership and was offered a position to work on rural farmers and did quite a good job. Had been doing the work before working for them, but in this appointment, she had an opportunity to do more work. There was Breitbart, who was a conservative columnist. Columnist found a recording of a keynote that she was giving to the NAACP and spliced it and made it seem like she was saying she wouldn't help white farmers, which that wasn't what happened. And so the news came out, everybody freaks out. Vilsack calls and says if they want her to tender her resignation without even hearing the original. They didn't know that the video had been spliced. And so they then asked her for her resignation. She resigns. Once they heard the whole tape, Obama called her, Vilsack offered her another position, but at this point she was like, yeah, no, I'm done. And so this is somebody who has dedicated her life to civil rights, has worked with farmers and tried to make sure that Black folks, especially in rural Southern communities, have access to education and a whole, healthy, happy community. And so this work was a demonstration both of the historic discrimination of the USDA, her personal experience. And so it was really important to sort of hear her talk about agriculture has the potential to liberate, but yet the USDA has had this rich, long history of discrimination. And even, there are some policies that were outright racist, right? There were some that were written to favor large landowners in certain communities. But even when that wasn't the case, there were ways that employees of the USDA were so disrespectful that when a Black farmer came in to ask about some of the programs or some of the loans or some of the assistance that the USDA is supposed to provide, and they provide to white farmers, they literally denied those resources, access to those resources, applications, and information to Black farmers. So the entity that's initiated to govern agriculture, being racist, also perpetuated a massive dispossession of Black folks and land. Did I answer your question?
You absolutely did. That and that's such a old and tried story. I'm reminded that in 1910, Black people owned 15 million acres of land.
Right.
Now it's down to, is it 1 million?
Less than 2% of all farmers are Black. All land is owned by Black people. Yes. A precipitous drop. And so Pete Daniels' book talks about dispossession and the strategies that the USDA engaged to force that dispossession. And so, yeah, I mean, and so there were, the things that the USDA did, but there were also things that the white racist neighbors were doing, right? So they would do things like terrorize a family. They would, have a dispute, and a Black person who spoke up for themselves would be threatened. That's where this crazy moniker comes in. So-and-so isn't paying attention to these norms. And so one of the farmers told me, he's like, you have a dispute with a white farmer, and then your life is threatened. And especially for this family, they were in Tuskegee. He said, overnight, you would find yourself in Birmingham because you had to leave your life dependent on it. And then after that, you were in Detroit. So they had a very clear trajectory of Black folks who fought against the exploitation and the oppression and the vindication, or the ways that white folks, were coming back to. And so there are examples where white folks, if we migrated out of force, out of fear for our lives, they would then co-opt the land. And then if you paid taxes for so many years, you claimed ownership of that land. And so the transfer of those, the transfer of land in those cases, there was a historical society, and I can't remember the name of it, but the basement conveniently had a fire. And in that basement were all the tax records of the exchange of land from Black folks to white folks. And conveniently, so there is no future retribution for this injustice because y'all done burned up right. And so it's just really interesting to see the various ways that Black people were dispossessed of the land and the ways that the government was also complicit in it, which is why this current historical moment is so interesting. Because, when I came to Wisconsin, I remember the first talk I gave, there was a young brother who was in a PhD program in education, and he's born in Silver Spring. And he said, when I read the title of your talk, he said, I couldn't even conjure up an image of a Black farmer. When you said Black farmer, he was like, okay, farmer, but Black? And so now, right, and just what can seem, as a short period of time for us old folks, like this whole conversation has changed. People now see Black farmers. People understand why Black farming is important. And we've changed the language from tenant farming, sharecropping, and slavery to one of land, food, and freedom. And I think that has a lot to do with the ways that folks today are both doing the work, but also how we're talking about the work.
What I appreciate by that, and we want to kind of wrap it up on this note, and the note is that the story you tell is a story that barely makes it into the main African-American narrative, even in the radical narrative, even in the nationalist narrative. The emphasis you put on land is quite different. And so what I want to kind of ask you is, what changes in our historical imagination and sense of possibility if the story that you're telling is gets much wider currency?
Yes.
So how does your story transform African-American historiography?
I hope it does, because what I think has happened before me has been the danger of the single story. And if the frame that we've always used for explaining Black people's relationship to the land has always been one that's oppressive and exploitive, then an asset-based approach, which was what the Detroiters were telling me was there, I needed to then find the historical examples of the ways that Black folks turn to land or use land as a part of our strategy. And so it's my vision that unearthing the voices of Black farmers and people like Reverend Paris, who says you can feed yourself when you can you can free yourself when you can feed yourself, or Mrs. Hamer saying nobody can tell me what to do, like really understanding not just what that means to them, but what are the ways that manifested itself. And so I think that with this this alternative narrative, I feel like it gives us a lens that allows us to have different kinds of freedom dreams. Like you can have a freedom dream that allows that community to be fed by somebody else. You can have a freedom dream, I don't think, that doesn't also talk about us as a part of the ecology. And I think that the freedom dream and looking at the ways that Black folks, Black farmers particularly, I think one, because of the urban bias in the way we tell Black history, we've ignored rurality. And now we see this reverse migration where Black folks are returning to air property, to the South, folks in Chicago, going back to Mississippi, like it's happening. And so how do we understand that? And I think that the narratives of the migration has only concentrated on those of us who left and little attention to those of us who stayed. And so I think that that narrative, those who stayed, those who fought in different ways, those who retained the land and created Black institutions, I feel like that looking at and adding Black farmers to the conversation, it allows us to think differently about our own history. It allows us to unite with the Black folks who believed in this and who created a way out of no way. I don't know where or how anybody has ever been around farmers and can say that they're not smart. I can go with Mr. Burkett. He will tell me, I'll pick up a feather. He'll say the original name, the nickname, he can tell me plants, flora, fauna, everything. And so I just really believe that understanding and interrogating Black farmers in a liberatory frame allows us to understand that, yes, while the historical legacy of slavery still exists, right? There's still legacies that we're unpacking. One of the strategies toward freedom and liberation is to reconnect and reconsider our relationship to the soil, reconnect our I don't have to tell you, as much as Helen is outside and does her walks and, spending time outside, we know that being outside is healing. If the frame has been one of trauma of our being outside and food production, then that leaves us missing an important component of our strategy. If we change the narrative and offer a counter narrative or one that is, okay, so yes, that, but also this, I think it widens the possibilities of a future that is well fed and that is well cared for and allows us to make sure that we think about things in terms of developing community health and wellness. And the reality that folks say Black folks don't do this and we don't go outside and we aren't doing this. We know COVID required us to find different kinds of strategies. How many people found peace and comfort in the outside? And so I'm really hopeful that the language that we're hearing and the trajectory that is shifting then allow, or at least the conversations are different in a way. I can't tell you how many, even Baba Malik told me, he said, when COVID hit, he said he couldn't stop his phone from ringing. Everybody was calling, asking him how to grow their own food. Like the time is now for us to think about that. And I think that rooting our current in the historical significance of Black farmers and elevating those voices gives us a way forward.
Monica, that was wonderful, and I'm really clear that this linkage of acquiring land in the South, cooperative farming, the land trust that you talk about, building on the models of Freedom Farm that Fannie Lou Hamer had built, and the broad programs that were created by the Colored Farmers Association. And people often, they talk about the Garvey movement as the largest African-American organization. It wasn't. It was the Colored Farmers Association, right? 1.2 million, and half of them being women. Right. But that story, I don't know that we have a book on the Colored Farmers.
Well, Omi,
there's a dissertation.
Well, he's got a book. Omi, the lion's mouth.
Ah,
It is a book.
okay.
Yeah, I think you even pointed it. I thought, well,
No,
only.
that wasn't me.
In the Lion's Mouth is a book that talks about the color farmers' lions.
Okay, good. So the other piece that you had that I think is fantastic is this notion that for those of us in urban rural spaces, that we can return to practices of our grandparents and great grandparents and also begin to create a level of food sovereignty as well as food security. So I want to.
I'm sorry, let me just say there's healing in the land. There's healing in that work. And it is also important for us to honor and elevate the work of our ancestors and to reconnect to that as we think about mutual aid, as we think about redesigning our cities and caring for each other. This food conversation becomes critical.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Monca M. White, I want to thank you for joining me tonight and for such an insightful presentation.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Cindy. You're the best.
You're welcome. Love you. So this has been the first broadcast of Real Talk with Sundiata Keita Cha-Jua as your host. The purpose of this podcast is to focus on history as a weapon for Black liberation. And so the discussion with Dr. Monca White took us back and tried to think of ways in which we could connect our rural past to the urban present in a way in which the focus is still around self-determination, autonomy, and building just greater health, right? Through eating more nutritious food and through the labor involved in growing the food. And so I want to thank those of you who have watched and those of you who will watch. And good night.